Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes just to let the room fill in. So just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Thanks for being here, though. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, so just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. We're just waiting for the room to fill. I'm going to repeat the message a couple of times, but thank you for being here today. Welcome everyone to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started shortly in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill a bit. Just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started shortly. We're just waiting for the room to fill. About in a minute or so, we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar today. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our members through events such as these, volunteer opportunities, campaigns that we work on, coalitions, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A as we go, but we won't get started until the end. So a little bit about what we'll be covering today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. But before we get into all that, let's talk a little bit about why we're here. So TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of the problem. So they noticed issues around them, such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness in their communities. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in these concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions to the issues that were in their communities. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden on low-income people and communities of color. So many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has a potential to even further exacerbate inequality within our region that some of our founders have been seeing for the last couple of years. So because of this affordability crisis, our communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, born and raised, and I've seen both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities, what that means for them and their own situations. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have really succeeded both for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame for our region's issues, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing communities. And we know that tech workers care and want to help and don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic we're currently in, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know, we feel this, we've heard about this, we know people who are experiencing this. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants or renters have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization and it's where tech is headquartered, but a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success, and without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. Before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of about a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. And we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. So we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar, joining in on the discussion, and just learning more about issues in our area. So our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. So we do this through a variety of ways, but some examples are book clubs that we host, panel discussions with experts in the field, webinars such as these, voter guides that we produce around election season. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked on with a coalition of legislators, community organizations, renters, a big coalition to help pass this, which now extends protections to about 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice aiming to turn companies into agents of change and agents of equity in the broader community. So we do this through corporate partnerships and corporate engagements. That's companies working with TechEquity together. So tech workers have an outsized political power that's largely been untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. And so connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplace, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. So at TechEquity, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of the issues and everything that we're seeing in the Bay Area and California and across the country, these issues really are intertwined because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal at TechEquity is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, like we talked about, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis really is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our communities are feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So, in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and across the country. And that policy is redlining. So, redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So, on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. So, those are those red blocks you can see on the screen on the map of San Francisco. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. And in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in, as we talked about, is decades in the making. Way before tech. And it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends all across California and all across the country. So these are examples of other red line neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, both two up and coming tech hubs, but just to show you all different case studies of red line neighborhoods other than in California. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who have lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase, sudden loss of a job, your car breaks down, things like that. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but like we talked about, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So as we can see in this chart, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement, so unions, dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. So while there's a gap between work and pay and productivity, like we just looked at, there's also a gap between pay between race. And so what this chart is showing us is that white men are earning more cents to the dollar. That's that orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to Black men and women, which are the two blue bars on the right side of the screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at how a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom apartment working a normal 8-hour day. It's a regular shift, right? 8 hours. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to be able to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work. And this problem persists across the country. So even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, Atlanta, as we're seeing in the news, aren't as high, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, and cooks who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goals for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that bracket, that big blue bar all the way on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary, which we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the 2 small bars on the left side of the screen. So as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are those orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI, that's below the poverty line, are in a more drastic situation and where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. And so that's why that last blue bar is actually increasing. There isn't enough affordable housing at those lower levels of affordability to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. So as we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are at higher percentages living in liquid asset poverty. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, and lack of affordable housing production have created this crisis of displacement. And displacement really is driven by policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress, because the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. We can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is the result of years and years of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So at TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis. And that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that are making it too expensive to build. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize, maintain, and improve existing affordable housing. Protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. It's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. Racial equity. So racism is embedded in our economic, in our political, and in our social systems. And it's embedded in us all, especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are being upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about the short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors, as we talked about, are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we've created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards, and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with us as an organization. We host tons of educational events. We have one coming up on a discussion on what it looks like to end homelessness in California. So I'll be talking about that more in a bit. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation page, which we're organizing our membership around, including a rental registry, extending paid family leave, and we'll talk about more of that in the next couple of slides. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get involved on these issues that we talked about today, from employee engagement to policy advising. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email after this. You can reply to that email and we'll connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as easy and as accessible as possible to plug in, but also while building community in the process. So this year, we're excited to continue our work in housing and labor spaces through creating ethical workforce practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? As we talked about, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Or you can take action by supporting some of our priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So the first one is rental registry. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data about our housing market. And better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure help is being targeted to the people who need it most. So TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that that data is being used fairly through our rental registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year. So we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rent registry, and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack channel to stay updated on our progress with that. You can also take action on various other pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So we have decided to focus our advocacy on these bills because they'll do the most to ensure that an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available for all Californians. So if you like more information on these bills, I'll be including a link to the landing page with more information, and you can join us as community endorsers as well. And for upcoming events, we have one upcoming event that you can register for. The event is called Ending Homelessness in California, where we'll hear from homelessness experts and advocates that will talk about the root causes of homelessness in California, what programs are currently working for the state, and what policies we need to get passed so that every Californian can have a place to call home. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member for $10 a month or $100 a year, or you could take action with us in a variety of different ways. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to look in the Q&A and see if there are any questions. This webinar was recorded, so I'll be sending out a follow-up email with links to everything that I talked about, a link to the PowerPoint presentation, a link to the recording. So feel free to share that around. You can also reply directly to that follow-up email if you have any questions afterwards, or if you want to connect with me. So I'll take a couple of minutes, see if anything comes up, but please drop those into the Q&A. Ariana is asking, do we take volunteers? Yes, we do take volunteers. So we actually have a civic tech program. So there's an opportunity if you want to donate some of your skills and your time to work on projects that we're currently working on. So we're looking for like UX researchers, engineers, just basically any type of skill that you may have, coding. I can connect you with our civic techs manager, and he can maybe put you on our list or reach out to you about what potential projects we have coming up. So we do have volunteer opportunities at the moment. And then Nadia is asking, will we get a copy of these slides after the presentation? Yeah, we'll be sending out the whole presentation slide deck and the recording as well. Cool. So I just want to thank everyone for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. Keep an eye out on that email. Feel free to reply to the email and ask me questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Just thank you for everything. And I hope to see you at a future event, future volunteer opportunity. And if you're still unsure as to how you want to participate with the organization, please feel free to reach out to me and we can schedule some time to talk on a one-on-one call. So just thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and hope to see you soon.